Hello, everybody. Welcome to the public presentation of research of the 2017 students of the Outer Banks field site. I'm Andy Keeler. This is my co-director, Lindsay Dubbs. We run this field site, allegedly. The field site is a joint enterprise of UNC-Chapel Hill and the Coastal Studies Institute here in Wanchese, and its primary focus is a semester-long residential program for upper-level undergraduates. These students get a rigorous academic program, they work in internships with local mentors, they interact with the community in a variety of structured and unstructured ways, and they also collaborate on a field-based research project. What you're going to see here today is that research project and the students' presentation of it. On behalf of the faculty and students, we'd like to thank some of the people who have helped so much this semester. First, our Community Advisory Board. That's helped them so much learning about life in Eastern North Carolina and made them feel welcome in the community, led by our wonderful chairperson, Bill Smythe. We have a lot of new members this year, and their expertise and willingness to help added a huge amount to the research project and generally to how much students learned about the Outer Banks and how they felt comfortable here.
The UNC CSI community has also been great, sharing specific expertise and general professional knowledge with our students, both informally and formally. The UNC Institute for the Environment, represented here today by Senior Associate Director Tony Reevy, as well as the Curriculum for Ecology and the Environment and the UNC Study Abroad program, have been valuable partners in providing these students with a great experience. Thank you also to the internship mentors, and I see several of you here in the room. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for all that you have done to give the students valuable work experience in a variety of projects. We also would like to thank the many people who helped the orientation and field trips throughout the semester. So many people, as you will see in the students' closing slides, have really made this semester memorable for the students.
We haven't rehearsed this. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the excellent Outer Banks field site faculty and staff, Linda DeAnna, Corey Adams, and Kim Armstrong. It was Linda and Lindsay here who had the primary responsibility for overseeing the research that you're going to see here today. A couple of things to introduce the research. We knew we were asking the students to take on a really complex topic, and we stressed to them that it's not their job to come up with the right answer or to tell anybody what to do. Their job was to use the tools of rigorous academic research to learn new things about shoreline management, its effect on ecosystems, and the way the public and government think and learn about the options they have. So part of what you're going to see here today is not just what they've learned, but how they learned it, which means there's methodology and statistics as well as results.
And secondly, what you're going to see has some elements of a work in progress. Carrying out original and secondary research in 4 months while taking a full load of classes, 17 credits in total, spending 2 days a week at internships, and hanging out at the beach is a lot to ask, and these students have done a wonderful job of it. If we had a couple of more months, they would have even more to say about this subject, although I don't know that they would want to study it for a couple of more months. I think that they're pretty ready to be done. The students would love to talk with you after this presentation and hear more about your ideas and experiences with shorelines and natural resource management generally on the Outer Banks if you would like to speak with them further. There is a written report that goes along with this oral presentation, and it can be found in the back. There are a few paper copies back there, not written, they're all written. And then there are a few flash drives also back there that have the report in PDF format. The PDF can also be found online. If you just Google OBXFS, you will be directed to the UNC Institute for the Environment's website, and the report can be downloaded there if you decide you'd like it at a later date. And now, please welcome the Outer Banks Field Site Class of 2017.
Hi, I'm George Gildehouse. I'm from Durham, North Carolina. I'm a junior environmental studies major.
Hi there, folks. My name is Kurt Nelson. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm a senior, and I study environmental studies and history.
Hi, everyone. My name's Tara Smith. I'm a junior environmental studies major from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Hi, my name's Cassandra Bridges. I'm a sophomore environmental science major, and I'm from McCordsville, Indiana.
Hi, I'm Paris Evans. I'm a senior environmental science major from New Orleans, Louisiana.
Hi, I'm Brett Wells. I'm from Whistling Pines, North Carolina. I'm a junior double majoring in environmental studies and public policy.
Hi, I'm Mark Stansel. I'm a senior environmental studies major from Raleigh.
Hi, my name is Emily Inkroat. I'm a junior environmental studies major from Sanford, North Carolina.
Hi, my name is Danielle Curtis. I'm a junior environmental studies major and I'm from New Jersey.
Hi, my name is Indy Mackinson and I'm a junior environmental studies major, journalism minor from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hi, I'm Amelia Ward. I'm a junior studying environmental science and I'm from Asheville, North Carolina.
Hi, I'm Emily Pierce. I'm a sophomore environmental sciences major from Durham, North Carolina.
Hi, I'm Bianca Gartner. I'm also from Durham, North Carolina, and I'm a senior studying environmental science. All right, hello. Once again, thank you all so much for being here today. We have been working all semester on this research project, and we're really excited that you've come out today for us to share what we've learned about estuarine shoreline stabilization options and its relation to public perceptions and greenhouse gas implications. That would be a good first step. There you go. All right, so here is a roadmap for today. We're going to start out with a brief introduction, give you some relevant background, and provide some context for you. And then we're going to get into the meat of our research project. So just like our title suggests, we took two different approaches to understanding estuarine shoreline stabilization. The first is a more natural science approach to understanding those global greenhouse gas implications. And secondly, we have a more social science or human dimensions approach to understanding the public perceptions of estuarine shoreline stabilization. So after that introduction, we're going to get into that first natural science portion, and then we're going to get into the social science and discuss the methods and results there. And then finally, we'll wrap it all up with a conclusion. So without further ado, here is Emily Pierce for the introduction.
Thanks, Bianca. So as Bianca said, we want to start with some relevant background on some important topics for our project. So first, estuaries and the services that they provide. North Carolina has over 10,000 miles of estuarine shoreline, which is really valuable because of all of the ecosystem services that shoreline provides to us. An ecosystem service is essentially a benefit that we derive from the use or existence of that ecosystem. And some of the ecosystem services that estuarine shorelines provide include water filtration, habitat, recreation, and one really important one for us here today is carbon sequestration. So, carbon sequestration is essentially when plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere and incorporate it into organic matter in their roots, leaves, and stems. Carbon can also be sequestered as organic matter is washed up as debris from the water and incorporated into the sediments. So carbon sequestration is particularly important for estuarine shorelines because of their ability to accrete vertically, which means that as sediment is washed up in the water and trapped in the shoreline, it's able to grow upward so that those sediments never become overly saturated with carbon. So clearly, this is a really important ecosystem service. However, the carbon stored in estuarine shorelines is not stored there forever because of degrading threats like erosion. So erosion is a pretty big threat to estuarine shorelines. As you can see in this graphic here, from the estuarine shoreline of Hatteras Island, the shoreline has been moving back because of erosion over time. So localized erosion can be due to aspects of your shoreline like slope or orientation. However, we know that overall rates of erosion are increasing because of bigger impacts like coastal development or climate change, which covers impacts like sea level rise, increasing storm intensity, which also lead to increasing erosion. So because of increasing erosion, there's also increases in shoreline property owners seeking to stabilize their shorelines. So there are two main ways that shoreline property owners can stabilize their shoreline, using hardened structures or living structures. Hardened structures can often include things like bulkheads, as you can see here, which are walls made of things like metal or wood. They can also include riprap preventments, you can see in the bottom right, which are structures made of like rock or concrete up against the shoreline, whereas living structures, including sills, which you can see in the top left, structures made of natural material like oyster shell built up with spaces in between to allow water and creatures to move, or just simply planting vegetation to stabilize the shoreline. So with these two different types, there are a lot of different consequences and benefits of each one. But we can see from shoreline stabilization data that most shoreline property owners are choosing to use hardened structures. And we want to explore a little more about living structures. So here's Bianca again to tell you more about what a living shoreline really is.
Thank you. All right, so just like Emily said, what really is a living shoreline? These kinds of stabilization methods are a relatively new concept, but they're gaining recognition in coastal communities as a really great option. Something's happening, but it's fine. All right, yeah, so defining living shorelines. There really isn't one definition set in stone and used by all thus far for living shorelines. Just here you can see two different approaches at defining living shorelines. The first is from the North Carolina Coastal Federation. It's about 10 words. It's really simple, gets to the basics. And then right after that, you have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers definition, a lot longer, more detailed, more complex. But instead of really getting into the words and sorting all that out, we all know that a photo is worth 1,000 of them, so here we are. This photo is also taken from the North Carolina Coastal Federation, and it's actually of a site called NCAT, the North Carolina Center for the Advancement of Teaching. And it's a center we all got the opportunity to go visit earlier in our semester. And don't worry, the vegetation has filled in, but it is still a perfect definition of a living shoreline, which is essentially a method of stabilizing a shoreline using natural elements like rocks or oyster shells in conjunction with the planting of marsh grass or other kinds of vegetation just to protect a shoreline and the habitat that that shoreline provides and any other ecosystem services from that shoreline. So now that we know what a living shoreline is, we can understand its centrality to our entire project. So our main purpose was to understand these living shorelines from both that natural science perspective and the human dimensions perspective as well. So the way we went about understanding the natural science portion was by measuring carbon sequestration, which Emily just told you about, in living shorelines versus reference shorelines. And then the way we went about understanding the human dimensions aspect was interviewing different private property owners and organizations about their perceptions of these different shoreline stabilization methods. So now to get into the nitty-gritty of the natural science, here's Amelia Ward.
All right. So despite the many ecosystem services that living shorelines provide, we wanted to look specifically at carbon sequestration and to quantify the amount of carbon that living shorelines are taking in and storing, because in the face of climate change and increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, if living shorelines are taking in more carbon than they emit, they could serve as one mechanism to help mitigate some of the adverse effects of climate change. And so we originally hypothesized that living shorelines would sequester carbon at a higher rate than they emit it because of their high rate of primary productivity and relatively low rates of decomposition. And with that said, up next we have India to talk about some of our methods.
Thank you. Hello, I'm India, and I'm going to introduce our natural science research methods. All right, so we went to 5 living shoreline locations throughout the Outer Banks, going as far away as the Wildlife Resources Commission in Edenton and Durant's Point at the end of Hatteras Island. The NC Coastal Federation made us aware of all of these projects. So while some of these sites were used as reference marshes, others were used as a central part of our carbon sequestration research. So this is a core that we took from Durant's Point. And you can see here a really distinct color change between the top organic matter-rich layer and the baseline layer. Yeah, so the lighter sand color and the difference between the darker organic organic matter-rich layer gives us a really distinct baseline in our cores, which are basically a profile of the soil at each location. So this baseline just establishes a age 0 for all of those living shoreline locations and gives us a reference between the living shoreline and any previously occurring natural shoreline, which distinguishes carbon sequestration between the two. So the first site that we went to was in Edenton at the Wildlife Resources Commission boat launch. This site was the oldest living shoreline project we went to, and the shoreline consisted of an offshore sill with vegetation. The vegetation there was really different from most of the other sites that we went to, with sawgrass being the predominant species over juncus or Spartina alterniflora at our other sites. This location was also the freshest water location. Another site we went to was at Jockey's Ridge, which was just a vegetated shoreline and had really middle-of-the-road salinity and age compared to the rest of our locations. So another site we went to was right here on Roanoke Island at Festival Park. This shoreline had an offshore sill in front of a natural occurring marsh. So because there was a naturally occurring marsh, we did not have a really clear sandy baseline to look at in our cores, like in the slide I showed you before. So because of that, this was used as a reference control site in our carbon sequestration research analysis. We also went to a private property in Frisco, which was also a sill in front of a naturally occurring marsh. So this was also used as a reference control site. This was the most saline water that we had out of all our locations. And finally, we went to Durant's Point at the end of Hatteras Island, which was the youngest living shoreline project we went to, and also had some of the most saline water out of all of our locations. All right, next, we're going to have Danielle to continue methods.
So now that you've heard a bit about our sampling sites, we wanted to talk to you a little bit more in depth about our actual sampling methods. So we began by dividing all of our sample sites up into 3 replicate transects, as you can see in that image. And the transects consisted of both a high marsh and a low marsh location. We defined low marsh as 0 meters from the shoreline and high marsh as an area slightly further inland where there was noticeable change in the type of vegetation present. And we also, at 2 sites, Durant's Point and Jockey's Ridge, had a reference marsh available, so we could use that as somewhat of a control to compare against our living shorelines. And at our different locations within the transects, we took 2 types of samples. As India mentioned, we took core samples, and we also took vegetation samples. We also recorded data such as date, time, salinity, and the type of vegetation present at each sampling site. So what were we really looking for? We were focused on 3 things primarily: biomass, organic carbon content, and carbon sequestration. And that's all well and good, but what does that actually mean? So if you look here, it kind of ties them all together. So biomass is defined as the mass of living organisms such as plants or animals, or in this case, vegetation. And vegetation contributes to the soil organic matter content. And as the soil organic matter content increases over time, it allows for the marsh to accrete or build up. And as the marsh accretes, it can sequester a greater quantity of carbon. So to go a little bit more in depth, we'll start with biomass. So we measured 2 types of biomass, above and below ground biomass. And for the above ground biomass samples, we collected vegetation in the field. And for the below ground biomass, we collected soil cores. And then once we got back to the lab, we dried both samples to a constant weight before homogenizing them, which meant that we ground them up so that we could take a small representative subsample. We then combusted the subsample, so we basically set it on fire, and we weighed it before and after combustion. And the difference in those 2 masses represented the loss on ignition or the organic matter content. And then we could use that value with the area we took the sample from to calculate biomass. So what did we find? So we'll start with above ground biomass. Our results were actually somewhat surprising. We found that the greatest quantity of above ground biomass was at Jockey's Ridge, not WRC or Edenton. We expected it to be greater at Edenton because the vegetation was far more dense there than at our other sites. However, this might actually be why it was lower there, because we had to intentionally choose locations to take samples that were less dense because our core tubes tended to break many times when we went for the dense vegetation. So that might explain that one trend. Also, we found that the low marsh had a greater quantity of above ground biomass than the high marsh, and we think that this is because marsh plants receive most of their nutrients from the water, and the low marsh plants are more frequently inundated, which would mean that they would have more nutrients, which would allow them to grow faster and larger. For the below ground biomass, we observed actually almost opposite trends. The below ground biomass was greatest at Edenton, which is primarily a result of its age. Edenton was our oldest site at 13 years old, whereas Jockey's Ridge was only 8 and Durant's Point was 5.5. So because the site was older, the plants had a greater time to accumulate biomass and contribute to a greater below ground value. We also noticed that for below ground biomass, the high marsh had a greater quantity of biomass, and this is the result of two things primarily. One, the high marsh is older than the low marsh, but also the low marsh is more frequently affected by hurricanes. And we looked at some data, and our sites have been affected by 8 different hurricanes in just the past 2 years, which is a lot. And because the low marsh plants are in less stable soil, they're more frequently wiped out, which means they have less time to accumulate biomass. Now, Emily will talk to you about carbon.
Thanks, Danielle. So to start off looking at carbon sequestration in these living shoreline projects, we began by measuring the organic matter content in the soils. So organic matter content is basically the amount of the soils that comes from living things like plants and animals. So to do this, we extracted our cores from the core tubes and separated them into depth increments that were 5 centimeters. And then because organic matter combusts and the sediments do not, we combusted each 5 centimeter increment, so we lit it on fire, like Danielle said, and we compared the before and after masses to determine the amount of the soils that comes from organic matter. So what did we find from this? We found that organic matter content tended to decrease with depth, as you can see in this kind of confusing graph on the left. So in the top 0 to 5 centimeters of our cores, we found the most organic matter content, and this is due to the influence of surface vegetation. So there are more roots and organic matter in the top of the soil. So as you can see at the bottom of the graph, some of these cores showed increases in organic matter, which is kind of confusing as you would think that there would be less influence from vegetation. But we believe that these trends are due to the impacts of historic peat layers. So our cores actually went down from the living shoreline matter into the sandy baseline, and then below that into the presence of soils from old peat layers. And we did find that the organic matter content was highest at our natural marsh sites and at our reference sites. This is due to the fact that these sites have had more time to accumulate organic matter content and more time for plants to grow. So we use these results to look at carbon sequestration, which, as Emily mentioned earlier, is the process by which plants take in carbon as CO2 from the atmosphere and hold it in their biomass and in the soil. So we calculated this by adding up all of the organic matter content in each core and then dividing that by the age of the living shoreline project. So this gave us approximately how much carbon is being sequestered by these projects per year. And here are our results. This table shows our average sequestration rates at each site. And this is really exciting because we found that every single site that we went to showed a positive level of sequestration. So these projects are actually acting as carbon sinks. These results were very variable, and we think this is due to the impacts of storm events and different types of vegetation, which sequester carbon at different rates. And as you can see, we have these 2 little asterisks in this graph. This is because we could not calculate sequestration rates for marshes for which we didn't have an age. So further research could look into calculating sequestration rates for these different sites. And now, Mark is going to come talk to you about how these results align with our hypotheses.
So what can we learn from this data? Well, part of our original hypothesis was that younger shorelines would have a greater capacity to sequester carbon, and these results actually do show evidence in support of that hypothesis. You can see this top graph here is an overall look at how carbon sequestration varied with age of the different sites. But if we clean that top graph up a bit and only select the locations for which we were able to get a sequestration rate and then average the results at each of those locations, we get the bottom graph here, which is a little bit easier to read. You can see that marsh age and carbon sequestration actually correlated quite well. We have an R-squared value here of 0.9055. Essentially what R-squared tells us is how well does our data fit a certain trend, and 0.9055 is actually a really good result. So the reason that we hypothesized this in the first place, and the reason that we think we're seeing this trend in the data, is because when you first plant a living shoreline, those plants are going to have the greatest capacity to grow and develop root systems. But as time goes on and more plants accumulate, they won't grow at quite the same rate because the soil will reach a saturation point for root systems and plant growth. So if we remember that carbon sequestration is essentially just plants growing and taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and converting it to plant matter, this correlation actually makes a lot of sense. So the next step, once we get these results, is to determine if we can trust what our data is telling us. So to do this, we look at other studies that looked at a similar topic to us. So this table is a synthesis of many different studies that looked at carbon storage in marshes in the east coast of the United States. Most of these studies looked at naturally occurring marsh with the exception of two. That's our study here and Davis et al., which is a paper that we based much of our research methods on. So if we'll notice, the top sort of headers here are essentially just the things we just presented on. Carbon sequestration, percent organic carbon, and bulk density. Bulk density is not something we spend a lot of time on in this presentation, but it is something that we calculated to help with our results. So if we break this table down, because there's kind of a lot going on here, and keep those same headers, but arrange results of each of these studies roughly in order from highest to lowest, we can see what these other studies are telling us about our own results. So for percent organic carbon, we would have thought that our percent organic carbon would be lower than in a natural marsh. That's because there's less plants, because they haven't had as much time to develop, and we can see that that is the case here. We're in the 0 to 7% range, which is lower than most natural marshes. So what this tells us is that our assumptions and understanding of organic carbon in living shorelines is most likely accurate, and our data that we collect on it is probably fairly reliable. So again, for bulk density is essentially just a measurement of how dense that soil was in our cores. And since plant material is less dense than soil, and we had less plant material, we would expect our bulk density to be higher, which not only is our bulk density higher, but also Davis et al.'s bulk density is higher, which tells us that our understanding of bulk density in living shorelines is probably fairly accurate, and once again, that our results are most likely pretty reliable. So finally, carbon sequestration. Like we just said, since there is this negative correlation between age and sequestration rate, we would expect our sequestration number to be higher than a natural shoreline, and once again, we see that this is the case with both ours and the Davis et al. Paper having a higher sequestration rate. So once again, it just tells us that our understanding of sequestration and the correlation that we found is probably an accurate finding, and that our results are reliable. So one last thing that we can learn from this carbon sequestration table over here is it puts that 762 grams per meter squared of carbon in context for us a little bit. It's great to have that number, but what exactly does it mean and how much higher is it? Well, if we look, we can see that the natural marsh findings here are generally in the range from about 150 to 250 grams per meter squared per year, whereas we're over 750 grams per meter squared per year at our highest finding, which tells us that we found significantly more. So just in conclusion, we have results that did support our hypothesis, and we have a larger body of literature on the subject that tells us that our results are probably fairly reliable. So to talk about the implications of these findings in regards to greenhouse gases, here's Brett.
So not only are living shorelines sequestering carbon in its soils, but it's removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And in current discussions on how to reduce carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and mitigating climate change, increasing the potential of these wetland plants to sequester carbon could be a part of the dialogue. But this concept of using vegetation and its ability to sequester carbon has been focused on terrestrial carbon stocks, especially for forests, particularly REDD. Now, REDD stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, and it values and recognizes forests for retaining biodiversity, but also intaking a vast amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then being stored in its roots and vegetation. And in turn, developing countries are compensated for not converting their forests into other land uses like agriculture or other development. But these programs, such as RED, of incentivizing landowners and governments to not convert their natural resources, has not been incorporated into coastal ecosystems, especially through living shorelines. So we kind of wanted to know, what if this concept was applied to living shorelines? Especially, what if shoreline stabilization along North Carolina's coast was increased 50%, but only using living shorelines? So how much total carbon could be sequestered, and in turn, how much carbon dioxide could be removed from the atmosphere? So currently, 7% of North Carolina's coast is stabilized with either bulkheads or ripraps, and that constitutes about 800 miles or 1,200 kilometers. So if 50% of this amount of stabilized shoreline was increased with living shorelines, it would be about 600 kilometers of shoreline. But to determine the amount of carbon that could be sequestered per year, we needed to determine area. And from our living shoreline projects, we had an average width of 8 meters. So multiplying 600 kilometers by 8 meters gives us an area of 4.8 million meters squared. And then from our results, we calculated a net carbon sequestration rate of 183 grams of carbon that is sequestered per meter squared. So we multiply that by the area, and we kind of hypothetically estimated that almost 1,000 tons of carbon could be sequestered with this hypothetical expansion of living shoreline along the coast. So how much carbon dioxide does this relate to? About 3,500 tons of carbon dioxide would be removed from the atmosphere to be sequestered from this into a ton of carbon in the soil. And just putting that in context, removing 3,500 tons of carbon dioxide would be equivalent to offsetting the emissions from about 362,000 gallons of gasoline combusted. So removing carbon dioxide has direct economic impacts with increasing carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere, and increases the probability of intense storms and widespread droughts. And these have direct economic impacts, such as property damages from floods and the increased food and water costs associated with that. So the input and emissions from carbon dioxide have a direct economic impact. So the next step is kind of quantifying how much of these economic impacts comes from the increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Well, a bunch of federal departments came together in 2010 as an interagency working group and did all these comprehensive economic modeling, and kind of determined that for every additional ton of carbon dioxide that is emitted into the atmosphere, it has economic impacts equivalent to $50. And this $50 is the impacts from property damages and increased food and water cost. And this is kind of called, or otherwise known as, the social cost of carbon. So this social cost of carbon is applied to the amount of carbon dioxide that would be removed from the expansion of living shorelines. We could almost see that potentially $177,000 of avoided social costs could be avoided and mitigated through the expansion of living shorelines that intake carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, there are always limitations with proposals and policies like these, so Kurt is going to talk a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Brett. So when it comes to discussing living shorelines and their carbon storage potential, it's important to consider their limitations in reversibility. And so first of all, when erosion and storms can reverse the carbon storage processes that are occurring in living shorelines. And so also human development can do this. So that could be infrastructures such as beach houses coming onto shorelines and erasing the marsh's flora, fauna, and sediment. And so there's also limitations to carbon storage in living shorelines. And that mostly has to do with it being difficult to measure and come up with a specific method to really accurately portray the full potential of carbon storage within these living shorelines. And this actually relates to crediting individuals, as Brett was discussing, because on a case-by-case basis, it would be difficult to accurately look at people's shorelines and determine how much carbon is being stored within them, and then giving them a dollar amount for that carbon storage. So regardless of these limitations and the reversibility of carbon storage in living shorelines, they still provide us with a vital ecosystem service, as our studies show, of carbon storage. And other studies also show that they provide us with ecosystem services such as habitat and erosion protection. And so now we need to really look at future research into the feasibility of crediting individuals for the carbon storage that's occurring within their living shorelines. So thank you all. And now Cassandra is going to introduce the human dimension side of our study.
So from the beginning of the semester, we knew that our research was going to be divided into two main components. The natural science research into carbon sequestration that you guys have just heard a lot about, and a second section that is more social science related and focuses more on what people do here in the Outer Banks. We tried to make it on a more personal level and just try and better understand how people make decisions concerning their shorelines. Now, this is really important because what people do with their shorelines matters. Any sort of shoreline protection measure, be it a hardened structure like a bulkhead or a softer structure like a living shoreline, has environmental impacts, and these can be negative, positive, or a combination of the two. So in trying to research this further, we just wanted to get a better idea of what people are doing with their shorelines now and why they're making these decisions. So before we even took the next step with this research and, developed a comprehensive interview guide and started to really begin our research, we all sat down together and talked about what we wanted to find out more about. And we kind of developed this into four main questions. So firstly, we wanted to know what people here in the Outer Banks value. We wanted to know what's important to our interviewees and whether this factors into the decisions they make when they are trying to protect their shorelines. We also wanted to know where people go for information when they are trying to get more information and they are trying to make these decisions. Thirdly, we wanted a better idea of what the ideal shoreline is here. What do people want to have on their property, and are they achieving this goal? And lastly, we wanted to know if people and organizations had opinions on the permitting process, and if so, what these would be. So next up, we're going to have Paris tell you a little bit about our qualitative methods.
Thanks, Cassandra. For the human dimensions portion of our research, we conducted qualitative interviews. Our interviews were semi-structured, and the questions varied depending on whether our interviewees had installed a protection measure on their property, had acquired the property with a protection measure already installed, or had not installed a protection measure and had a natural shoreline. We interviewed private landowners with soundfront shoreline property and representatives of organizations that manage soundfront shorelines. Our initial interview referrals were solicited from our contacts at the Outer Banks field site, the UNC Coastal Studies Institute, and the North Carolina Coastal Federation. And this jump-started our beginning round of interviews. And from there, we asked each interviewee for further referrals. And this generated a pool of potential interviewees. Our interviewing began in early October and continued to mid-November. In total, we interviewed 26 individuals, 18 were private landowners, and 8 were representatives of organizations. Their properties ranged from Duck to Hatteras and included Roanoke Island and Edenton. The private landowners had shorelines that varied from unaltered natural marsh to bulkheads, sills, and riprap. We audio recorded all of our interviews, and then we transcribed them word for word. We then used a software called NVivo to create codes like cost, permitting, and recreation to categorize the contents of our interviews and to sort them based on the topics our interviews discussed. Using or organizing it in this way, we were able to find patterns and themes in what guided our interviewees through their decision-making process. These interviews provide us with a lot of interesting information for our results, which Tara will elaborate on more.
Thank you, Paris. Now that Paris has outlined how we collected our data, I can go into a little bit more detail about what that data told us and how we interpreted it. Keeping in mind that the ultimate goal of this section of our research project was to determine what factors were the most critical in determining the decision-making processes of our interviewees, we identified 4 facets of our data set that were influential in this regard. These factors were erosion, values, information, and feasibility. And feasibility refers to factors like permitting and costs that have to do with the logistics of installing shoreline protection. With that being said, let me pass the mic off to George, who will tell you a little bit more about how erosion impacted the experiences of our interviewees.
So one of the questions we asked all of our interviewees was if they were experiencing erosion on the property that they owned or managed. And what we found is that overwhelmingly people did observe erosion on their property, and they saw it as pretty much a norm of owning shoreline property. So one person said it's just something to contend with on the waterfront. You're always having to deal with it, and you have to have some sort of stabilization there or it's going to erode. So this was a lot of the reason why people thought they needed to protect their shoreline. It was really almost every case of people we interviewed. There were a couple cases where people were inside on a canal or inside a creek where they didn't experience erosion because they were protected from some of its causes. There's also one instance of sort of a non-response, but overwhelmingly people had noticed erosion on their properties. As for the causes they attributed to it, sometimes it was very easy to locate the cause. Someone in a hurricane, huge chunks of their land had disappeared, so it was easy to associate that with a hurricane. Other times, it was caused by smaller storms or storms over time, like nor'easters, other sources. Also, this was a little less common, but people brought up sea level rise as a possible cause of erosion on their property. And also that was noted as a reason for possible, in some cases, people saw accelerating erosion. A couple people put a number on it as they've seen accelerating erosion in the last 10 years, and that was attributed to sea level rise. And it also, something people noticed it was causing, that erosion was causing, was the loss of certain natural landscapes that had existed either right on their property or off their property. These included marshes, beaches, sand spits. Here in one case, someone brought up, when I bought it, they were referring to the property. There was a cove out there, what they call a sand spit. Another person said Roanoke marshes used to almost join Wanchese from Mans Harbor. So these are some observations of habitats, landscapes that used to be out there that people have noticed have since eroded away. And we also had some interesting findings regarding how neighbors influence erosion, and Cassandra is going to talk about those.
So as we started going through our interviews and trying to pick them apart and see what themes began to emerge, it became really, really obvious to us that there was one theme in terms of erosion that almost everybody we interviewed was talking about, and this is the impact of neighbors on one's property. So neighbors can have really devastating effects on your property if you aren't aware of or if you aren't aware that the potential is there. Interviewees discussed having a neighbor install, in most cases, a hardened structure, and then immediately seeing increased rates of erosion on their own property. They attributed this to the hardened structure deflecting the energy, and this energy, instead of eroding the person's own property that put in the hardened structure, it got deflected to the sides of the property, and their neighbors were experiencing more erosion as a result. Now, this was really interesting to us in part because most of the people who were talking about it were discussing the fact that they'd had no idea that this was going to happen. They were really shocked that by somebody trying to protect their own property, it was resulting in hurting somebody else's property. And this was not intentional in any way, shape, or form. And in many cases, it's what pushed our interviewees to install protection measures because of the increased rates of erosion from their neighbors putting in hardened structures. And this in turn kind of created a chain reaction of events, and this can result in entire stretches of shoreline being armored. One individual gave us a quote that really exemplifies this. They said, "I can give you an example. To the north, they've probably lost about 150 feet of their property. It's eroded so bad." And people are just talking about how much a neighbor's decision can impact their property. So we think that this is something that definitely could have more research conducted on it in the future. And we definitely want to point out that this is a really big impact that a lot of people just aren't aware of. So next up, we're going to have Tara talk about the values of our individuals.
As we began to wade through our data, it became clear to us from the responses of our interviewees that there were 5 values that were frequently alluded to by the interviewees themselves. These values were aesthetics, recreation, place attachment, ecocentrism, and security. During the earlier part of our semester in our coastal management class, we learned extensively about how values have the opportunity to influence specific human behaviors. Given this information, we wanted to determine, firstly, what values were present within our interviewees, and secondly, if these values ended up influencing their decision-making processes in terms of shoreline protection. However, as it turns out, not all values are created equally in terms of their influence on the decision-making process of implementing shoreline protection. 3 of our 5 values, aesthetics, recreation, and place attachment, did not ultimately end up being influential in the decision-making process. However, this is not to say that we didn't learn anything valuable from our closer inspection of these values. For example, in aesthetics, we learned that the look of a property is really important in drawing people to the area. Although it doesn't end up being influential in the later stages of homeownership, it is still important to consider that people really value the look of their property, as exemplified by this quote. Furthermore, in terms of recreation, people frequently alluded to how much they enjoyed the recreational opportunities that their property and shoreline specifically provided them. However, upon further inspection, it appears that it is more likely that in terms of pursuing shoreline protection, people consider recreation as just one of many considerations they're making in terms of the larger decision to protect their shoreline. Lastly, through our interviewees, it became really clear that people love this place and it is very special to those who live here. While we did not find that this was ultimately influential in terms of deciding to protect their shoreline, it is important to consider that that is probably one of the underlying factors that people consider when protecting their shoreline. And lastly, this brings us to the values that did translate into shoreline protection. These were security and ecocentrism. Security obviously referring to the desire that people have to protect their shoreline. We found that among those who expressed an intense desire, a security value, these were most likely represented by interviewees who had either purchased property that was bulkheaded, decided to implement a bulkhead, or were looking to implement a bulkhead. They also frequently expressed this value in terms of the immediate need for protection. This suggested to us that there exists a perception amongst our interviewees that if you want to immediately protect your property, that a bulkhead is the way to go. In contrast, among our interviewees who expressed an ecocentric set of values, or a value of nature for nature's sake apart from human benefit, they exclusively implemented living shorelines. In addition to this, they also expressed the sentiment that if you want to do the best thing for nature, that a living shoreline is the method of shoreline protection that you want to implement. This suggested to us that, again, amongst our interviewees, there existed the perception that living shorelines is the best option for the environment. While all the values didn't turn out to be equally influential in terms of their effect on the decision-making process, we learned something unique from each of them. With that being said, I'm going to pass the mic off to Kurt, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how information affected the decision-making process to pursue shoreline protection.
So before we conduct our interviews, we hypothesized that information sources would have an impact on people's decision making. And what we generally found from analyzing our interviews, that this was a true statement, that information sources and the acquisition of knowledge did have an impact on people's decision making for their shoreline. And after going over our interviews, we assessed that there are two groups of people, and the first group of people was those that pursued knowledge, and the other group of people was those that did not pursue knowledge. And so there are a couple different characteristics that made up these two groups of people. And so for those that looked for information, we found that the lack of knowledge really drove information seeking. And so these individuals that looked for information sometimes tended to be people that were new to the area and really didn't know exactly what to do with their shoreline, or didn't think that they knew what to do with their shoreline. And so they didn't think they had enough information to make an informed decision. And so there is also another characteristic, and this was that people that looked for information also might have been property managers. And the reason that these people looked for information was because they really were looking out for a diverse group of individuals and needed to work out a number of different interests, or had to work with a number of different interests from these individuals. So naturally, in order to make an informed decision, they decided that it was important to acquire as much knowledge as they could. So for the group of people that did not pursue information, one of the characteristics was that they had enough information already, or they believed that they had enough information already. And these tended to people with a lot of years in the area. And so this quote right up here kind of puts that into better perspective. So a lot of the knowledge is just historical. It just comes from being here and knowing the wave action and the various different areas of the island. So another characteristic of people that didn't pursue knowledge was that they might have occupational knowledge. And so this, for example, this could come in the form of someone that was in the bulkheading industry and already had a lot of knowledge about hardened structures. And so they already believed that those were the way to go, and that they had enough information in order to make an informed decision about their own shoreline. And so finally, another characteristic of people that didn't look for information was that they just didn't know where to go. And so this largely was people really not exactly knowing who is in charge of distributing this information or where exactly to go to get this information. And so these people would really maybe look out at other people's shorelines that are next to them, and not really, they really just didn't know where to go for information, so they tended to just go with whatever option was closest to hand. And then finally, for people that didn't look for information, they tended to make assumptions about their shoreline that may or may not have been true. So some people would say, yeah, I don't think my shoreline is good for a bulkhead, or it might not be good for a living shoreline. But that's the two groups of people that we've found. And now Bianca is going to discuss more about the themes that we found for information seeking, as well as the sources of information that people went to.
Thanks, Kurt. So just like Kurt said, there were two different groups of people, ones that did and didn't go out for information. But also through looking at our data, we found a couple themes. And the first was that of being impressionable. And this comes in different forms for people that did look for knowledge, didn't, or have been here a long time or not. But the overarching concept is that if someone came and weren't completely set on a decision, didn't have all of the information, and were kind of looking externally for some input, they took the first thing that came. And a lot of our interviewees situations, it was we moved here, we didn't really know what to do, but our neighbor had a bulkhead and it looked like it was doing fine, so that must have been the right thing, so we went for it. In other situations, it was a conversation with a neighbor or a friend or a family member just explaining more in depth about a particular method, and their understanding of that method kind of turned it into the ideal method in their mind. So that was the idea of being impressionable by just some information you get at first. And the second main theme that we found was a confusion of who is responsible for the dissemination of the information in the first place. Much like the quote on the screen, this particular interviewee just was like, I didn't know if I was supposed to ask the questions or if they were supposed to tell me everything I needed to know. That initial confusion of whose responsibility was it, that was a major roadblock to complete and wholesome information, understanding and utilization in the decision-making process. So after that, we found these 4 main sources of information to be the main ones sought after by the decision makers. First is a personal network, much like a neighbor or a group of friends. And then there was also contractors and organizations that were hired or went to for information. And these were mainly, discussed in terms of a representative or online materials being sought after. And lastly, there were educational resources commonly cited as a source for information. A few of our interviewees actually reached out to university professors, and one actually cited educational materials from universities as the most accurate and unbiased information out there. So that was where people went. But one thing that we found that was surprising was something that didn't make the list, which was permitting agencies. A lot of the time, our interviewees talked about permitting agencies as just the place you went for a permit. That's what they are, permitting agency. But what is surprising is that they're actually some of the organizations that are most well-equipped to inform decision makers in the first place. So the North Carolina Division of Coastal Management literally has a property owner's guide to determining the most appropriate stabilization method, yet they would only be sought after to get the permit instead of actually doing the informing. Also, NOAA, they have a similar guidebook to inform and to help someone make the decision. But we found that our interviewees weren't aware or just didn't use these resources as their primary methods. So moving forward, if we could kind of elaborate on the role and the ability of these agencies to be more of a source of information, that would really speed up and improve the information dissemination in these decision makers' process. So next up, we have Paris to talk about ideals.
Thanks, Bianca. One concept, ideals, is one that we asked for explicitly from our interviewees in the question, what is your ideal shoreline like? And a large majority of our interviewees said that their ideal shoreline is a sandy beach with uninhibited water access. But none of our interviewees had this. The aforementioned findings factor directly into why ideals did not appear in the shoreline protection decision. Firstly, the historical and persistent toll that erosion takes on an unprotected shoreline and the drastic and severe erosion that occurs during storm events left our interviewees not wanting to take any more losses. Secondly, when fortifying a shoreline, neighboring protection measures matter, and based on our interviews, the overwhelming push from neighbors was toward installing a bulkhead. And lastly, a lack of resources regarding living shorelines led our interviewees to make decisions without comprehensive knowledge of their options. In these ways, the environmentally conscious values and ideals that we found in our interviews could not always be incorporated into the shoreline protection decision. And now George will talk to us more about feasibility.
So one thing we wanted to look at was for private property owners, for individuals, were costs a big barrier or a big part of the decision-making factor between installing a certain type of shoreline, or were they a big difficulty? And what we really found is that they were second to effectiveness, whether the shoreline protection measure was effective at reducing the rate of erosion, and if people considered somewhat of ecocentric values or something like that, protecting a habitat, that was also considered, whereas costs were secondary to that. As this person pointed out, said, we're trying to figure out what we thought would work best, then looking at the costs, then thinking about what would look good aesthetically. And another reason costs were sort of secondary to effectiveness of the protection method was because that people perceived that all of these protection methods were pretty expensive. So as one person phrased, it's all costly, it's all time consuming. And that was kind of reflected in some of the other things we saw, in that for different organizations and individuals, it wasn't always that bulkheads or living shorelines were cheaper. Some people mentioned one was cheaper, other people mentioned the other was cheaper, depending on the details of their property. So it wasn't necessarily the biggest decision-making factor, as it could have been. Another interesting thing that emerged, especially with individual property owners who were installing living shorelines, was mentioning some of the non-monetary costs that are involved in installing living shorelines. This person said, I would say the cost wasn't cheap, the manpower wasn't easy. As far as learning about the grasses, they just thought they were doing something right. That was their opinion. But basically, several living shoreline owners mentioned that learning about the ecosystem they were creating was kind of an additional complication in installing a living shoreline as opposed to other methods. And Brett's going to come up and talk about how organizations understood the funding process.
Thanks, George. So with our 8 interviewees from public organizations, we kind of gain insight of how organizations fund their living shorelines. So all of our interviewees said that partnerships were essential in the funding of their living shoreline, specifically with well-funded, specialized organizations. One representative said they're able to go to the national office and pull from some of those resources that we as a small nonprofit wouldn't have. So just the opportunity to look for partnerships open up some options for various organizations. And then for interviewees who didn't install a living shoreline but were considering a living shoreline, the opportunity of a partnership to reduce individual costs onto them was appealing. This interviewee said if there was grant money available to reduce the cost of the living shoreline, which probably wouldn't be available for the hardened alternative, I think that would have a huge impact. And similar cost share programs include the NOAA Coastal Resilience Grants, which was $18 million dedicated to restoring estuarine ecosystems, and some of that money was allocated for private individuals to install living shorelines. But a lot of that is really hard to get on a case-by-case basis, so they often went to nonprofits such as the Coastal Federation to access that partnership money. And then now I'm going to hand it back off to George to talk about the permitting process and how that influenced decision-making.
Yes, so we were interested in if the permitting process was a big factor in people's decision-making, whether it influenced it at all. And really we found that it wasn't a particularly big influence in people's decision-making. Generally when people went about getting a permit, they'd already made a decision about their process. And this was consistent with other studies we'd found, is that permitting was not a huge decision-making factor. In terms of whether it was easy, yeah, it was easy for some. It was a hassle for some other people. That didn't really depend necessarily on the type of shoreline they had. There was a general sentiment that living shorelines were harder to get a permit for, but it wasn't necessarily a discouraging factor. No one saw permitting as a process that totally changed what their decision. And that was somewhat inconsistent with some studies we'd seen that suggested that there was a large bias in the permitting process, making it difficult to install living shorelines. And maybe the reason we didn't find that was because the study's so small, and if we had more living shoreline owners we were looking at, we would have found a bigger result. It also could have been that it's been an issue since it's been noted before that it's been addressed more. Or it could also be that because people who are installing living shorelines have already gone over the barrier of getting more information about it, they already have certain values that make them more interested in installing living shorelines, that permitting just wasn't a huge barrier after they'd already overcome those previous barriers. But yeah, we found that people were coming to the permitting process late in the game as opposed to at their decision-making place, and that also has some interesting implications, as mentioned before, with information sources, that people weren't getting to the information sources that permitting agencies have until after making a decision. Another thing we were interested in was climate change, particularly because our natural science research, we had looked at the carbon sequestration potentials of living shorelines, and so we were interested in whether that was something people were considering in their decision making, or whether they were thinking about climate change in relation to their shorelines at all. Here in this example, someone was thinking about it. Said, 10 years ago the water was 25 feet out and now it's totally different. It's a changing environment. It seems to be changing rapidly, whatever anyone thinks about, global warming and sea level rise. This was one person who mentioned global warming, and there were less than a handful of others, but really it was not mentioned very often among interviewees at all. It was sometimes more commonly indirectly mentioned in this context when, as I talked about before, people talked about sea level rise in relation to their shorelines and accelerating erosion, but it was rare to directly mention it, and absolutely no one brought up anything climate change related in terms of talking about what decisions they made for implementing protection measures on their shorelines. So people weren't thinking about carbon sequestration already, maybe because there's not a lot of information about that out there, and that was one of the reasons we focused on that for our natural science study, or maybe it's just not important to people in the way they're making their decisions about their shorelines. And so now I'm going to invite Amelia up here to give you our conclusion.
So in our study, we did find that living shorelines are acting as carbon sinks, so their implementation could serve as one method to help mitigate some adverse effects of climate change like sea level rise. We also found that due to the reductions in atmospheric carbon dioxide, they would qualify for ecosystem service payments through programs like carbon credit-based policies. And also just the need and importance of educating people on the various methods available to them, as well as the local and global impact of their method, because a property shoreline is not an isolated unit, but part of an expansive estuarine shoreline whose wetlands provide many ecosystem services that benefit everybody. So that concludes, I don't know what I pressed, so hopefully I didn't break it. That concludes the capstone portion of our presentation. Up next, we have Brett to talk about some of the fun educational experiences we had over the semester.
Thanks, Amelia. So over the past 5 months, we got to really understand the Outer Banks in its form of its history and also its ecosystems. So one of some highlights that we wanted to mention was that we learned about the waterfowl history in Kerala when we went up there for the first part of the semester, and we went down to Ocracoke to learn some more about the maritime history. And also we learned about fisheries management, which was really interesting for a lot of us. We went up to the Division of Marine Fisheries up in Manio, and this is a picture of a fish that they dissected, and they kind of showed how they age fishes based on their ear bones, which was really interesting to see for the first time. We went in a plane to see what the Outer Banks look like from an aerial view, which was very interesting for a lot of us. And all throughout the entire semester, we went on field trips to learn about the ecosystems of an estuary, and that beats all like the time you can spend in the classroom learning about ecosystems right in the field as opposed to a classroom. And then now Cassandra's going to talk about our internships that we had for the semester.
So I think that almost all of us, if not all of us, at this field site this semester have turned out incredibly happy with their internship placements. Like, definitely speaking for myself, I loved mine. We were placed according to our interests in most respects. Before we even came here, we did interviews or phone interviews with our internship coordinator, Corey, and he helped place us with internships that sort of served our own interests. So we had people working with local governments in Manio and Nags Head. We had people working in more of the management, environmental management positions, such as in Nags Head Woods. And I personally was at the Kerala Center for Wildlife Education, and it was incredible. I got to teach kids about little critters in the water, got to take them on kayaking trips, and I also got to work with the Marine Mammal Stranding Program and Nest and got to see sea turtles, which who can complain about that? So overall, I think we all had really great experiences with our internships, and it's been a great way to sort of get us into an understanding of what we might be doing after we're done with school. Finally, we're going to have Bianca talk about all the other fun things we've done.
So yeah, in addition to all the educationally, forced upon us, even though we loved it, events, we also, over the past 5 months, have gotten an amazing opportunity to experience the Outer Banks where you all live and love. We got a little bit of taste of that too. So we did the bowling, we did the food dudes, we did the beaching. We also had we have a parcel in a community garden really near the house that we've been staying at. And this reenactment of of a photo that I'm sure none of you have ever seen before. And it's just for Halloween, we did the good old Scooby Gang. We had a great Thanksgiving feast. We had a lot of birthdays also. There were so many opportunities to really live with each other and, experience our place. And so we really delved into that, and it was awesome. But nothing, educationally or not, would have been possible without everyone who helped. Primarily Andy, Lindsay, and Linda with us, maybe more than they wish. But and our guest house director, Jay, and everyone on the community advisory board who met with us and gave us feedback all semester long. Everyone else who helped out with the capstone, and also our internship mentors. Cassandra just talked about that. Mine are here. I interned at the Dare County Arts Council. Everyone really had a great time, and all those internship mentors helped a lot with our personal relationship with the Outer Banks. And last but not least, our interviewees who all anonymously agreed to give us the information that we sorted through and presented to you today. None of it would have been possible without them, and we're really happy that we learned a lot, and we're happy today that you guys all came out to hear about it. So thank you.
So I'm sure you guys now know everything you might possibly ever want to know about living shorelines, but just in case there's questions, the students are happy to answer questions about living shorelines and allied subjects. And we're welcoming questions from the audience here and also our online audience.
Thanks. My question is about the living shoreline and specifically the breakwater that appears to be in front of all of them, and the permitting process related to that. When you said the permitting process is about the same for bulkheads and living shorelines, does that include that installment of the rock sill in front of the shoreline? Did you guys get into the permitting process that deeply?
Yeah, we did early on in the semester. We were looking into the permitting process, and the results I was reporting were about how people perceive the permitting process, which is a little different from what the permitting process is. But yeah, we saw sometimes there can be there's permitting involved with putting a structure in, similar to with bulkheads and riprap, and there can also be. Often with living shorelines, there can also be forms you have to fill out for extending, because building up a marsh can extend the extent of your property, and the interaction with the shore is to some extent public property and the water. There's permitting revolving that involved with living shorelines as well. So it is a little more complicated generally.
Someone had mentioned how the younger extended shorelines captured more carbon. Has there been any further thought or studies in terms of intentionally renewing or increasing shorelines to have a bigger impact on the carbon?
I don't think there's been any studies looking at rebuilding marsh. I think that I don't think it would be possible to rebuild them in a way that would maintain that initial sequestration rate, simply because the soil underneath is becoming saturated and with the amount of carbon that it can hold. So just to answer your question, I don't think there has been any studies looking into it, but I'm not sure that it would be something that would be feasible. It would be nice if it was, but I don't think that it is.
I was a little curious about the peat. You said the older, much older layers. How much older was the layer where the peat was, where actually you did have higher carbon again? Because, and how would a long-term view dictate of a larger carbon sequestration impact if you're looking at the peat and looking to grow peat?
So we don't actually know the age of those historic peat layers. That was part of our issue in our carbon sequestration study, is that we could not determine an age for like natural sites. So we don't know the sequestration rate of those peat layers. They're probably very high in carbon sequestration because we did find a lot of organic matter content in those layers. But also we had issues with our cores. If we could have had deeper cores, we maybe would have had more of an insight into those peat layers, but they occurred right at the bottom of our cores, so we didn't actually see a lot of them.
Hi, this is not necessarily a question, but relating to one of the issues that you had dealt with your interviewees about not getting the correct information or not getting the information disseminated that is out there. For George knows me. George, what's up? I'm Ann, and I work with Dare Soil and Water Conservation District in Dare County in partnership with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. And obviously, funding private landowners wanting to fund their living shorelines is a problem. And I'm taking this, I'm not going to talk too long, it already sounds like I will, but because there's an avenue to reach more people to disseminate this information about where private landowners can get funding to help build their living shorelines. I administer a program in soil and water districts all along the coast of North Carolina who have areas where there are shorelines or places that can implement these, do get funding, so it's not just DARE, a community conservation assistance program that is administered through the Division of Soil and Water Conservation. And the goal is to implement best management practices, BMPs, to help with water quality. And one of those BMPs that are permissible in that program is living shorelines, or marsh sills is what we're calling them. And that program can help cost share private and public landowners on implementing those. And for the 3 years I've been implementing that program for Dare Soil and Water, every year I've had a private landowner and towns get cost share funding to implement living shorelines. So there is another avenue that is recurring until State legislation takes more money away from it, but what we're trying to do is rebuild that. But long story short, I thought that there might be people in this room or private landowners listening or whoever is going to maybe watch this online, that this could be a good way to disseminate that information. Sorry I took so long.
Hi, Erin Fleckenstein with the Coastal Federation. As you know, one of our goals is to promote the use of living shorelines, and we try to put a lot of information out there in the public. And so it's really interesting to me that you say that people don't know how to get that information. And so my question is sort of, in your interviews, did people say how they would have liked to have received information, where they would have liked to have gone, or do you have ideas for how we could better be proactive in distributing information about living shorelines?
So a lot of our interviewees didn't necessarily discuss where they wanted to find the information. They mostly talked about not having the information when they needed it. And I think part of that is a large demographic of our interviewee base is individuals who might not be as used to researching things online or looking for sources there. And I know that there's been a really big shift in information sources to being found online. So I think that part of the issue is that the information isn't reaching them in the same way. But I don't know how necessarily that could be changed.
In terms of how to get them that information, I also think that not waiting to be asked, and you have that information there and it's very available and it's very readable to people that know that they have to go get that. But if you kind of just, from what I gathered and from what we understood from the interviewees, if the information was made available before they even knew that they wanted to go get that information. So having more of an external presence instead of we're here and we're awesome, just come look at us. Like, if I feel like more outreach maybe might be more the way to getting that information. Just like people understood that the first thing that they think of, whether or not it's inceptioned where they think that it's their idea or someone else told them, but if you get that information to them and they see your logo at a local restaurant or somewhere else, that they understand that the information is already there instead of just coming to that conclusion on their own.
I also just wanted to add one more thing to that answer. I think it'd be, early in the semester we talked to, there was like a person that worked for NOAA who's saying that if you can get in contact with the people that are actually putting up these shorelines, like stabilization options, maybe like contractors, they can also be a good source of information because these people kind of have to go through these people. So by getting in contact with them and kind of asking them to give people like the full story and the full options, like the full range of options for shoreline stabilization, it'd be pretty beneficial for people to make good decisions on their shorelines.
Okay, and we have a question from an online audience member.
Yeah, so somebody who was watching online was wondering if you could talk about sort of what your greatest challenge in conducting the project was, or if they're looking back, something that you would have done differently.
So our biggest obstacle in our carbon sequestration research was those dang core tubes that kept breaking every single time we tried to take samples. So that was just one difficulty in our method. If anybody else has anything more in depth.
In terms of human dimensions, I think that interviewing people is a very comfortable idea. Everyone knows what an interview is. You watch Ellen, it's very normal. But actually like having an idea of what you want to understand and forming questions and going out, finding people, conducting interviews, and then the whole slew of analysis conducted afterwards. I think just the unfamiliarity meshed with the perception that we would be familiar with it was kind of a shocking it was a shock. And that newness was probably the hardest thing to get over. But once we kind of got into it, it was really exciting and it was different and it was like, and I know that's the catch-22. The hardest thing is to, have it. But I would say that that's probably a shared sentiment in terms of cluelessness in the beginning and then getting familiar and kind of taking it in stride eventually.
I think just overall, like, we came into this knowing it was a group project, and it's a 13-person group project. Like, that's hard. Like, you complain when you have like a 3-person group project in college, and like, this is insane. Like, it's a huge group, but we've really like come very far. Like, there are many times where what should have been a simple process was really drawn out just because you had to take into account the opinions of 13 people, which can make something that should take 10 minutes take 4 hours, and it definitely did at times. And that's really hard too because we're already really pressed for time with this project, and it was definitely a lesson in group dynamics and learning to take into the opinions of people who you might not agree with and find patience and not just all get frustrated with each other, especially when you all come home to the same house. So, but I think it definitely changed my view of group work. And now I think in the future, when I have smaller group projects, I will definitely appreciate them a lot. But overall, like, we definitely learned to work together really well, I think.
I saw a hand up here. Yes.
Looking back at the outlook in the different shorelines, do they have to do any kind of upkeep? So would the bulkhead have to be replaced, or how would you describe that part?
Thanks, Mom. So a lot of things with bulkheads, if a storm comes in and wipes out a bulkhead, a lot of the land behind it breaches. And then one of the things that we found out with living shorelines that with the roots and materials in the soil, after a hurricane comes through, it has the ability to recover. So a lot of our interviewees stated there was less maintenance with living shorelines. And I can't really tell if an interviewee with the bulkhead stated that maintenance was a hard thing, but yeah, maintenance is a thing to consider when considering shoreline stabilization options. Thanks, Mom.
My name is Michael Flynn with the Coastal Federation. First, I'd like to say I was very impressed by the presentations you gave on your internships. It was really nice to see how engaged you were with the community, and it seems you learned a lot and provided a lot of assistance as well, and an impressive presentation on your research throughout the semester as well. I'd like to elaborate on what Aaron and Ann said with respect to one of the first slides you showed, the rates of erosion. And so the academic research community and the agencies have been studying where some of these hotspots are. And the agencies are sort of on the reactive end. They wait to get approached by a property owner who might be interested in installing a living shoreline. But throughout your interview process, did you identify preferred means of communication to proactively engage with these property owners who may have more erosional shorelines than others? Would they prefer like a forum or mailers, or just a simple post at the post office advertising this information? Thank you.
I don't think we could answer that. That wasn't one of our research focuses, but that's an interesting question to look towards in the future of effective ways of communication.
I also think that anything that takes them the least amount of work is good. So just like Aaron's question, kind of how do we get our information out there? If you make it not only available once they search for it, but kind of outreach and make it seem like their idea, make it seem like they kind of had the grandiose idea to go and get that information and install a living shoreline, as opposed to just the ease of looking at a neighbor, maybe the ease of looking at a different neighbor or seeing a friend or having a community presentation, but just something that doesn't take them, oh, you have to remember this specific link and then go to just like less tasks, but something easy and something understandable. So not a 15-page report or a 55-page report on why living shorelines are good, but kind of a blurb, something to keep in their mind that is easily accessible and easily understandable.
As I heard you say that the hardscapes can have a negative impact on neighbors. Two questions arising out of that. Do living shorelines tend not to have those impacts? And two, is there any movement in permitting to take into consideration the negative impacts that hardscape might have on neighbors?
So I'm going to answer your second question first, and that is that you are required, I believe, when you're putting in any sort of shoreline protection measure to get the approval of the people around you. So I think that is one way of going about that. The issue with that is that just because this information isn't always widely perceived, people are, of course, they're going to say, yeah, sure, protect your property, you know? And additionally, in terms of living shorelines, any sort of alteration to the shoreline can have impacts because it does change the energy flow and everything else. The difference is that with living shorelines, with the sills and the openings in between them, the water still is able to be dissipated by the rocks and then dissipated by the marsh. So it's not being completely deflected in the same way that a hardened structure does.
I've got a comment and a question. If there's any agencies in here who are wondering how to be proactive, I think whenever there's a land transfer for shoreline properties, that would be a great time to send a mailer out saying, hey, we're here. This is how you get more information. I'm actually one of those property owners who had no idea what to do when I purchased a shoreline property. And it was only through CAMA that I learned about natural living shorelines. So thank you to CAMA and all the different agencies who helped me out to make the right decision to do a living shoreline. And my question for the group is, in your studies, did you only study shorelines that had the rock and oyster shell living shorelines, or did you look at marsh sills that had the sheet pile style sills?
I think we did mainly focus on either the oyster sill or the marl or the concrete, that sort of, we didn't really look into the wooden structures. And I think part of that is some people in the area have discussed the shipworms that are around that do eat into woods. That's another issue with wood bulkheads that people have been experiencing. So I don't know if that impacts why we looked into that, but I do think that's a reason they're not widely necessarily used in this area.
Also, the Jockey's Ridge Living Shoreline project did not have a sill in front of it. It was only vegetation, but not the other material that you were talking about.
Did you notice any correlation with and without a sill as to the amount of carbon that was fixed?
So we didn't notice a difference between sill and without sill just because we only had one site that did not have a sill, and it's kind of hard to make conclusions based on like one site. We found the correlation mainly with age, and the Jockey's Ridge site, even though it did not have a sill, did align with that correlation of age.
And the other was just more of a comment that someone mentioned that the permitting offices had information available, but people didn't realize it. Maybe you could collaborate with them and have them actually present information on the possibilities, not just have it available in their office.